Okay, this is going to be our notes for multiplying whole numbers and decimals by whole numbers and decimals. And we're going to be using a product box or an area model. So that's what this title of the notes says. But before I begin talking about everything you see here, I'm going to back it up and make it a lot simpler than what it looks here, because you can get very confusing if you don't understand the basics. So I'm going to back it all the way over here, and I'm going to ask you to see if you can tell me what the model using those base 10 blocks would look like for this number, for this decimal, 32 hundredths. Well, maybe you have something like this, where you have 32 of those little hundred squares, and that would be a good model. And you also might have said, well, there's 3 in the tenth place and 2 in the hundredths place. So maybe you have a model like this, where you have 3 tenths and 2 100ths, model like that. Okay, so both of those are great. I'm just reviewing the base 10 blocks models. So what about decimal that looks like this? Would this be a correct model for that? Well, we do have two holes, so there's one hole there and there's another one underneath, so that's okay. And you have a 1 in the 10th place, so there's the 1/10, but on the hundredths place we have a 7, and we need 7 of those little squares. We only have 2, so that would not be a correct model for this decimal. Well, what about if you have a decimal times a decimal, like a whole number in a decimal times a whole number in a decimal? Well, if you have looked at the other videos already on how to multiply decimals using the standard algorithm, then we can come up with the answer by doing that. And if we review that real quick, we just multiply as if they were regular whole numbers. So 5 times 3 is 15, carry the 1. 5 times 1 is 5, plus the 1 is 6. Then we put a placeholder and we do 1 times 3, which is 3, and 1 times 3, which is 1. 1 times 1, which is 1. Then we add up all the numbers and we end up with 5, 9, and 1. And if we use our bubble method, and again, if you haven't seen those videos, go back, because this might be going too fast for you and you don't understand what I'm talking about. Go back and look at those videos about multiplying a decimal by a decimal using the bubble strategy. Okay, so here's the bubbles that I've talked about in the other video, and the first bubble would have a 1, and the second bubble would just have a 1 also. 1 plus 1 is 2, so I have to move my decimal twice in my product, and my answer becomes 1 and 95 hundredths. Well, some of you, actually I had this activity in one of my classes, and I had a group of students who gave me this model for the multiplication that we just did. And they actually took it very literally whenever I said, model what you see. So they modeled 1 and 3/10, and they put a multiplication sign there, and then they modeled the 1 and the 5/10, and they put an equal sign. So that was very, very literal, and when I saw that, all I could do was just laugh. So here's my emoji for that. Anyways, then I asked another group, and they gave me this model for the same answer. You can see how they got their model by saying, well, you have a hole and you have a hole, so that's 2 holes, so there they are. But then they multiplied 3 times 5 and they got 15. So they added 1 plus 1, they got 2 holes, but then they multiplied 3 times 5. So they kind of mixed up multiplication and addition, and they got 15 little hundredths right there. I don't know about you, I don't know if you see what I see, but it looks like there's some eyes there, a nose and a mouth, maybe some teeth and a head. I don't know. SMH, shake my head. And then finally, there was another group who gave me this model. So it was 1 and 3/10 times 1 and 5/10. They did give me the 2 holes again, like the other group did, but then this time they didn't multiply 3 times 5. They actually modeled 3/10, which is that part, and then they modeled 5/10, which is that part. So basically they just added all the parts together. And all those are incorrect, because if you remember what we just talked about, when we did the multiplication with the standard algorithm, we ended up with, right here, with 1 and 95 hundredths, and none of the models that I just discussed especially this one. They don't have 1 and 95 hundredths. This one already has 2 holes right here, so that already is a lot more than 1 and 95 hundredths, and then you have some other stuff right there. So definitely not what we were looking for. The next model also has more than 2, so that's not correct. So here's what the model should look like. If we're going to model 1 and 3/10 times 1 and 5/10, we're going to model the 1 and the 3/10 on the side, and then we're going to go along the top and model the other number, which is 1. We're going to use the same hole, and then we're going to put 5/10 along the top. So I'm going to stop you right here, and I'm going to jump you to the next screen, which is going to review multiplication of whole numbers by using the box method, the partial products. So here it is. If you multiply 13 times 15, that means that we're going to multiply the 10, because the 1 is in the 10th place, and a 5. So we have 10 plus 5, that gives us the 15. And then we have the 1 in the 10th place and the 3 in the 1's place, so that gives me 10 plus 3, which is 13. So finally I have 10 times 10, that gives me 100, 10 times 5, that gives me 50, and then 3 times 10, and that gives me 30. And finally 3 times 5, and that's 15. To find the answer using the box method or the partial products method, we add up all the partial products, all the little answers that we got, to find the final answer, which is 195. Alright, so now that I've done that, let me take you back to this place. So the area model is pretty much the same thing as the box method. You have to end up with 4 parts to complete the whole square. So we need to fill in some information. First, let's figure out that this 1 by 1 represents just one whole. Then we have the 1 times 3/10, that just represents 3/10, and you can actually count what you have there. And then over here you have 5/10. So if you add up those 3 parts, you can see the 3 parts right there that are highlighted in blue, and you fill in your decimal and your placeholder 0, you'll end up with 1 and 8/10. But you need this box right here that I'm putting in red. You need to finish out the whole entire box. So that means that we have to fill in this little space right here by extending our lines or drawing the little squares. And if you count them all, you end up with 15. So those represent 15 hundredths. So we still have to add that part to our answer, which will end up giving us the final answer. We have to put a placeholder 0 so we can have the same place values. And finally we end up with 1 and 95 hundredths. So you can see that this right here is the correct area model for the original problem that I had my students try to model, which gives me the correct answer, and it matches my answer for the algorithm back in this place right there, 1 and 95 hundredths. Okay, so now that we went through all that, I am going to show you the actual notes that we started with. So we already know that we're multiplying a whole number and a decimal by a whole number and a decimal using the area model. So now this should make a little bit more sense now. So the first thing that we're going to do to use these notes is to estimate. We're going to estimate by kind of rounding, but it's a lot easier. We just say an approximate value, like some number that is really easy to work with, that's really close to the number they give us. So an example, the 1.5 or 1 and 5/10, we can estimate that to be around 2. And 2.5 or 2 and 5/10, we can estimate that to be around 2 as well. And the reason why I'm estimating both to be 2s is because we can just give one the 5/10 from the 2 and 5/10 to the 1 and 5/10, and make basically you making it two holes on both of them. This is called overestimating or underestimating. We don't want to round it up. We don't want to say that both of them go up to the next whole number, because if you do, then your answer is going to be it's going to be farther away than it should be for the final answer. Like the estimation that you end up with is going to be a little bit not as close as it should be. So let me explain that by finishing out what I'm talking about. So if you estimate both numbers to be 2s, like I've asked you to do, then you can multiply 2 times 2, and that gives you 4, which means your final answer should be somewhere around 4. Okay, so now let's go ahead and multiply with the area model. So now we have this box that we're going to fill in, and we're just going to start with 2 wholes and 5 tenths, right? So 2 times 2 is just 2 times 1 is just 2, so this area represents just 2 wholes. But then we have 5 tenths at the top, so we have 5 tenths right here, and 1 times 5 tenths, it gives me 5 tenths. So that's what the little section represents there. Then the next thing you have is 5 tenths along the side, but you have 2 holes on the top, so that means you have to fill in another 5 tenths underneath the second hole, and that gives you a total of 5 and 5, that's 10 tenths, which means that if you put them together, 10 tenths is the same thing as 1 hole. So that's why 2 times 0.5 or 2 times 5 tenths gives you that 1 hole that you see on your notes. So everything is just done for you already. I'm just kind of highlighting it so you can see what I'm talking about as I'm going through this explanation. So finally, the last thing is multiply the 5 tenths times the 5 tenths. 5 tenths times 5 tenths is 25 hundredths. And you can see that because there's 25 little boxes right here to finish out our area model with the base 10 blocks. So now that we have that complete, it's really easy to see that if we have that section that it represents 2 holes, and we add it to the section that represents 5 tenths, plus the other section that represents 1 hole, plus the last section that represents 25 hundredths, we come up with the answer of 3 and 75 hundredths. That's your final answer for the multiplication of 1/5 of 1 and 5 tenths times 2 and 5 tenths, which if we compare it to the estimation that we had said it was going to be of 4, it makes sense because 3 and 75 hundredths is really close to the answer 4. It's kind of comparing $3.75 to $4. It's really close. All right, and then the last thing I'm going to show you is the last problem on this notes. It's 1 and 5 tenths times 1 and 5 tenths. So just for a little bit more practice. So 1 and 5 tenths, we're going to estimate it to be around 2. And then that means that we gave it like another 5 tenths to make it a whole number 2. So the second 1 and 5 tenths, instead of giving it 5 tenths to make it another 2, I'm going to take away the 5 tenths so that I don't overestimate or underestimate. And our answer is going to be way off if we do that. So I'm going to underestimate this one. Since the other one I gave it too much, this one I'm going to take it away. So now I'm kind of making up for it. So 2 times 1 is going to be the numbers that I multiply. Well, hopefully you know 2 times 1 is just 2. And that means that my final answer, when I multiply 1.5 or 1 and 5 tenths times 1 and 5 tenths, should be somewhere around 2. Well, now let's do an area model and see if we get what we're supposed to get. So here's my 1 whole. That's going to represent my first decimal, 1 and 5 tenths. So now I need 5 tenths. So here's 5 tenths along the top. And along the side, I need another whole and another 5 tenths. So here's my other 5 tenths. So now that I've represented my two factors, to find the product, I need to make sure that I have all of the information filled in my box. You can see there's a part missing there. So right now, I'm going to go say this needs to be filled in with little bitty boxes, and if you count them all, you end up with 5 little rows of 5 boxes in each row. So that's 5 times 5. So 5 times 5 will give you 25. There's 25 little squares that I just filled in. So to find my final product, I have to count everything inside this big square, the red square. So 1 times 1, well, that's the representation of that one whole. And then if I multiply the 1 times 5 tenths, well, that's just this section right here, which is 5 tenths. And then again 1 times 5 tenths for the third section, that's also 5 tenths. And if I multiply the last section, which is 5 tenths times 5 tenths, that gave me the 25 hundredths. So all I have to do now is add them all up together, all the 4 sections, by lining up my decimal first, and then I have to put in a decimal and fill in some zeros for place holding places. And if I add correctly, I end up with 5, and then a 12 there, and carry the 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. Bring down my decimal, so my final answer is 2 and 25 hundredths, which if we compare it to the beginning estimation, which we got 2 when we rounded our numbers, or we estimated our 2 factors, we got the answer of 2. 2 is really close to 2 and 25 hundredths. So we know we did a good job multiplying using the area model and also using our estimation. If you have any questions, please see the next video where I'm going to show you how to multiply more of these kind of problems so you can get more experience, and I promise you it will get easier the more that you do. So make sure you watch the other video that follows this video on the practice problems. There's 4 more practice problems that you will see.